I've seen a lot over the years. Bodies in different states, families torn apart, screams of despair muffled by hymns played at a low volume. I've seen wakes with more flowers than people, and others where no one showed up. I thought that after a while in this job, we became immune, but I was wrong, very wrong. Something happened to me, something that doesn't make it into the funeral home records or into the whispers that circulate in the cemetery corridors. A story that began silently, discreetly, but ended in the only way possible when the inexplicable decides to reveal itself with fear, pure fear, dry fear, fear that sticks to the soul and never goes away. I don't like to tell this, but I also don't like what happens when I try to forget, because there are nights when I feel like she's still watching me, waiting for me to talk, waiting for me to tell, waiting for someone else to know what I saw that day. It all started with a pattern, an almost imperceptible detail. A specific type of wake, always longer, always stranger, and in the center of it all, a figure that almost no one noticed. A woman, old, silent, always in the same place in the chapel, and always the last to leave. At the time, I didn't understand why it bothered me so much, but once I started paying attention, once I dared to look when no one else was, I saw it. I saw what she did when she thought she was alone, and ever since that day, I've never been able to look at a coffin the same way again. And if you have the courage to listen to the end, you might understand why some funerals simply should not end too quickly. If you've come this far, it wasn't by chance. Maybe there's something in you that also notices what others ignore. A discomfort in the face of silence, a restlessness when night falls. On this channel, we don't tell stories to scare. We give voice to what has been buried without an answer. Here, each story is an invitation to see the invisible, to hear what no one dares to repeat out loud. And if you feel like you belong to this side of the story, the side of those who have already sensed something, who have felt an unexplained chill, then this space is also yours. Subscribe now, like, and get ready. Because the story you're going to hear today may change the way you look at death, and especially for those who are lurking in the loneliest moments of a wake. The cemetery where all this happened is in a small, forgotten town in the southern United States, the kind where everyone knows everyone else, and the main streets smell of old wood and accumulated rain. The name of the place is Springfield Hollow, a community of just over 3,000 people, surrounded by low hills, dirt roads, and a constant fog that never seems to completely dissipate. The funeral home was located on top of a stone hill next to the chapel and the municipal cemetery. It was one of those places you don't notice when you drive by, but that seems to attract everyone's attention when the silence falls. I'd been working there for almost 13 years. I started as a funeral assistant and stayed. Time in this type of profession is not marked by hours, but by burials. Each funeral is a story. Each crying face holds a piece of something that has gone. Over time, I learned to decipher the mood of the ceremony just by the sound of the family members' footsteps. If they shuffled slowly, I knew they were broken. If they walked in a hurry, it was usually guilt, remorse, or sheer embarrassment. But in all those years, nothing prepared me for the kind of discomfort that came with those funerals that seemed to drag on for hours. And every time that happened, she was there. People in that town have a certain, almost superstitious respect for death. There's no joking at a wake, no inheritance discussions in front of the casket, and nothing is touched until the last relative has left. This made some ceremonies longer than others, of course. But there was a particular group of funerals that defied logic. They started like any other, the body dressed, the makeup applied, the flowers all around, the family sitting in silence. But something happened after the first hour. The atmosphere seemed denser, as if the air had grown heavier, and even when everyone had said their final goodbyes, the wake continued, without reason, without justification. And I watched it happen. I watched the families leave in silence. I watched the staff leave one by one. And when the chapel was empty, she was still there, sitting in the last row, looking at the casket with a look that I didn't know if it was of mourning, respect, or something more. Deep. No emotion on her face, no gesture, just presence. Absolute presence. The first time I noticed this pattern was during the funeral of a man who had died of a heart attack at home. It was a simple wake, without many guests. But something caught my attention. The ceremony was scheduled to last an hour and a half, and it went past 3. No one seemed to notice the time, but I noticed, I felt it, and when the lady stood up, her eyes fixed on the casket, the clock on the wall stopped ticking, stuck exactly at 5:14 p.m. Things like this started happening more often. Equipment would fail, the chapel lights would flicker, the temperature would drop even with the air conditioning off, and always she was there. Even if no one invited her, even if no one knew where she came from. Of course, first I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was a lonely old woman. Maybe she had lost someone long ago and had clung to these rituals ever since as a way to maintain some connection with the world. But the uneasiness grew. Something about the way she looked at the dead, as if she knew something no one else there did, made my stomach turn. I still didn't have the courage to question it. I just watched. I made mental notes, and every time I saw her, I felt like she already knew I was paying attention, as if at some point I would see enough to no longer be able to unsee, and that's exactly what happened at the next funeral, because it was there that I realized she wasn't just there to mourn. That day, I discovered that she didn't attend wakes. She participated, and not on the side of the living. She was not a person who drew attention to herself. She always wore the same clothes, a dark brown coat, a crocheted scarf over her shoulders, and time-worn shoes. Her hair was thin and grey, held up with a discreet clip, and her skin, marked by deep wrinkles, gave the impression of someone who had seen much more than anyone would like. But even with this ordinary appearance, there was something about her that made the atmosphere change as soon as she entered. The chapel became silent in a different way, as if even the sounds of the wind outside were afraid to cross the threshold. She never spoke to anyone, not a gesture, not a greeting. She just walked slowly to the last pew, sat up straight, with her hands resting on her lap, and kept her eyes fixed on the coffin from beginning to end. She never looked to the sides, never showed any signs of tiredness. She seemed to be on another frequency, and that, over time, began to make me uneasy, because it wasn't just her constant presence, it was the way everything around her seemed to slow down, as if time respected her presence. Or maybe you feared it. The strangest thing was that no one else seemed to notice her presence. I talked to old employees of the funeral home, to colleagues at the cemetery, even to some family members who had attended the same wakes. They all vaguely remembered a lady sitting in the back, but none of them could describe her face, or even her clothes. It was as if the memory she left in people was erased with the end of the service. But I remembered every detail, every expression, or lack thereof. The pattern began to become more evident when I noticed that she only showed up at certain funerals. They weren't random. They were usually wakes for people who had died suddenly, heart attacks, accidents, freak falls. All the bodies had one thing in common. They hadn't prepared to die. It was as if the end had come too soon. And it was at those times that she would show up, sit on the same bench and watch as if she already knew what was coming. There was one ceremony that particularly struck me. A young police officer had died on duty. Many colleagues, uniforms, tributes. The family was in shock, and at the back of the room, there she was, motionless, watching with the same cold serenity as always. That was the first time I felt something almost physical emanating from her, a kind of pressure in my chest, as if the air in the chapel had become denser. And when the pastor asked for a minute of silence, the light from the candle lit next to the coffin simply went out by itself. No one commented, but I saw it. I was just a few steps away. On the way out, I tried to follow her discreetly. I wanted to see where she was going, if she got into a car, if anyone was waiting for her. But as soon as I crossed the chapel door, she had disappeared, literally. There was no car in the parking lot, not a single footstep on the wet ground. It was as if she had evaporated the moment the body was closed for burial. I went back inside on high alert, but the funeral went on as normal. Only I seemed to have noticed something different. It was at that point that I realized this was no coincidence. It was a presence, something that manifested itself at specific times. Maybe an entity, maybe someone with a mission I didn't yet understand. But the fact was, she wasn't just a funeral attendee. She chose the wakes, and she was doing something that no one else saw. I could have stopped there. I could have accepted the mystery and moved on with my life, but something kept pulling me closer. I needed to understand what she was doing, and it was this silent obsession that led me to the next funeral, where everything revealed itself with disturbing clarity. It was at this next wake that I discovered. She didn't just watch the dead. She chose who wouldn't be laid to rest. Wakes in that city used to follow a strict schedule. Most families wanted to get everything done in a maximum of 2 hours. Speech, prayer, farewells, flowers, casket lid, and burial. Everything was quick, direct, respectful, without too many detours. But the funerals that this woman attended followed a different rhythm, a time that seemed alien to ours. They started like any other, but there was always some kind of delay. Someone was missing. A flower was late being delivered. The chapel had some kind of electrical problem. And without anyone noticing, the hours passed. The clock turned, but no one looked at it. The first time I noticed this temporal distortion was during the funeral of a lady named Margaret Sullivan. She had died in her sleep, apparently without suffering. A traditional family, many grandchildren, friends were present. The wake was scheduled to last from 2 to 4 in the afternoon. At 5:30, there were still people milling around the chapel, looking at the coffin as if they couldn't decide when to leave. But the most striking thing was that no one seemed concerned about time. It was as if a kind of hypnosis hung over the room, and no one felt the passing of the hours. The only person who was still was her, sitting in the last row, as always, watching with that impassive and at the same time hungry look. Another case was that of a young man who had a motorcycle accident. The ceremony was scheduled for early evening, which was unusual in itself. When we arrived with the body, the chapel was empty. Preparations had been made, candles were lit, flowers were arranged. Little by little, the guests started arriving, and so did she, discreetly, almost imperceptibly. I sat on a bench to the side, just to watch. The clock on the wall read 7:10 p.m. when the ceremony began. When I looked again, thinking that 20 minutes had passed, it was 9:43 p.m., a time that simply disappeared. And the most disturbing thing was to realize that in that interval, I couldn't remember anything specific. It was as if my memory had been edited, suppressed. Over time, I began to keep track of the times. I kept a small notebook hidden in my pocket where I wrote down the exact time each wake began, when the woman arrived, when everyone else left, and most importantly, how long she remained alone with the body. I discovered a pattern. a cycle. She always remained at least 30 minutes after the last person left. 30 minutes of absolute silence, alone, facing the dead person. And on the rare occasions when I had to enter the chapel before she left, I found the atmosphere strange. The temperature seemed to have dropped, even though it was muggy outside. The candles were out, even though there was no wind. And, strangest of all, an almost suffocating feeling in my chest, as if the air was too heavy, thick, laden with something invisible but deeply real. I began to notice subtle details that had previously escaped me. Fingerprints on glass that no one had touched. Light impressions on the fabric of the coffin, as if someone had leaned against it. Perfume in the air, a sweet, cloying smell that reminded me of wilted flowers. And then I realized time was not the only thing she altered. She left traces. Presences, changes in physical space. Small, almost imperceptible, but real. Little by little, I understood that the question was not just, why did she stay so long? But what did she do during that time? And that ate away at me inside. I needed to find out. I needed to see. But I knew that by doing so, I would cross a line. Because there are things that, once seen, you can never forget. That's how I made the most dangerous decision of my life. At the next funeral she attended, I would stay until the end. And for the first time, I would be the last person to leave the chapel. But that night, when I decided to stay until the end, I realized that she was never there just to watch. And what I saw, when I thought I was alone, was something that silence tried to hide. But that time, distorted or not, will never let me forget. From the moment I decided to stay until the end, something in me changed. I was no longer just the routine gravedigger who came and went from the cemetery like someone who was part of the furniture of death. No, I became a vigilante, a silent observer of something that no one else seemed to notice, and with that came the obsession. I began to prepare in advance for the wakes where I suspected she would appear. I studied the names of the deceased, their histories, the circumstances of their death. The more sudden the departure, the more certain I was that she would come. I avoided talking about it with my colleagues. No one would believe me. And even if they did, they wouldn't understand. Because it wasn't just about her presence. It was about the feeling that came with it. The constant impression that what I was witnessing went beyond the visible world. And that somehow I had been chosen, or cursed, to notice. I began to keep a strategic distance during the ceremonies. I would stand at the back of the chapel pretending to arrange the flowers, adjust the lighting, or simply rest between one burial and the next. But the truth was different. My eyes were on her. They followed every gesture, every little movement, and it was precisely the absence of gestures that terrified me. She did nothing. She didn't cry. She didn't murmur. She didn't show any tiredness. She just watched, as if she were waiting for something to happen. At one of the most empty funerals I've ever attended, of a man with no close family, buried with state funds, she appeared, as always, alone, without explanation. There was no one to watch over that body other than her and me. I stood behind the wooden curtain that separated the side aisle from the main area of the chapel. And there, I saw her stand up. The clock read 6:06 p.m. She walked silently to the coffin. Her hands, aged but firm, lightly touched the edge of the lid. She didn't open it. She just rested her fingers on the wood. And then, she lowered her head as if saying a silent prayer. She stayed like that for almost 5 minutes, motionless. That night I had nightmares. I dreamed I was in a coffin, with her face hovering above mine. Her eyes had no pupils. Her mouth moved soundlessly. I woke up in a cold sweat with the feeling that someone had been in the room. I looked around, panting, and there, on the floor beside the bed, was a mark, a circle, poorly drawn with dust or dirt, as if someone had stood there watching me. From that point on, my obsession took on dangerous overtones. I began to avoid my own home. I slept in the back of the funeral home, claiming to be on call. I studied old records, cross-checking dates, times, attendance lists, and the more I dug, the more I realized that there was a hidden logic behind her appearance. She wasn't random, there was a purpose, and it revolved around those final 30 minutes. But no matter how much I investigated, no matter how close I got, the central piece was missing. I needed to see her in action. I needed to know exactly what she did in the moments when she thought she was alone. And for that, there was only one way. I would have to hide, make myself invisible to her eyes, and wait. It was with this fixed thought that I entered the chapel before the funeral that would change everything. I hid behind the wooden screen near the altar. I took a deep breath, and I waited. Because that day, I would not only stay until the end, I would witness what no one else dared to witness. What I saw that night behind the screen was like nothing a human being should witness. Because there, in the silence between her last breath and oblivion, she finally revealed herself. And it wasn't mourning that brought her back, it was something much older and much hungrier. The funeral was scheduled for a rainy Thursday afternoon. The deceased was a middle-aged man who owned a local garage and had been the victim of a trivial accident, a poorly supported ladder and a violent fall. His death was quick, but the emotion was profound. He was well known in the city, and the hall was full. And as expected, she was there, sitting in the usual corner, discreetly, wrapped in that dark brown coat that never seemed to leave her body. But this time, there was something different about her, a slight movement in her neck, as if she were more alert, more aware of everything around her. I arrived early, under the pretense of helping with the organization. I positioned chairs, handed out flyers, and arranged the flowers with more care than necessary. But my real intention was clear, to find the best place to hide. I chose the old wooden screen near the altar, which was rarely used. The wood was worn and smelled faintly of wax and age. I huddled behind it, my heart racing. I knew that if she saw me, all would be lost. I had to go unnoticed. I had to observe. The ceremony went as expected. There were emotional speeches, songs sung with trembling voices, and tears held back. Everyone seemed to be immersed in the pain of loss, except her. At every moment, the lady kept her eyes fixed on the coffin. She didn't look away. She didn't blink. She wasn't there for the deceased. She was waiting for the moment when she would be alone with him. And I knew that this time I would be the only witness. People gradually left, leaving behind the murmur of farewells. The sound of the rain outside muffled their footsteps, and soon the chapel was empty. At least, that's what everyone thought. I, huddled in the partial darkness behind the screen, held my breath when she finally stood up. Her movements were smooth, almost rehearsed, as if she were repeating an ancient ritual. She walked slowly to the coffin. The lid was already ajar, at the order of the family, who wanted an open final farewell. She didn't seem surprised. On the contrary, she approached with familiarity. What happened next, I never told anyone, not until now. And even now, as I tell it, my stomach turns and my palms sweat, because what I witnessed destroyed me inside. The woman leaned over the coffin. Her face was inches from the dead man's. She was mumbling something. The words were inaudible to me, but her lips moved steadily, as if she were reciting something she had memorized long ago. Her eyes were open, vivid, as if she were looking beyond the flesh. And then she reached out slowly and placed her fingers on the dead man's forehead. It was at that moment that the impossible happened. His body, rigid for days, moved his head slightly to the side. A faint twitch, but noticeable. It wasn't a spasm. I know what a spasm is. This was a response, a conscious reaction. His face tilted as if listening, as if understanding, as if wanting to obey. I froze completely. My body froze. My mind screamed, but I couldn't move a muscle. I stood there staring, trying to rationalize, trying to believe that it was an illusion caused by tension, by shadow, by fatigue. But it wasn't. I saw it. I felt it. Death had been interrupted. She then slowly walked away. Her face remained expressionless, but there was something in her eyes, a silent satisfaction, as if she had fulfilled a duty, as if she had sealed something invisible to everyone else, except me. After that, she walked to the chapel door and walked out into the light rain, unhurriedly, without looking back. And it was only then that my body responded. I dragged myself out of hiding, my legs shaking, my breath in pieces. I approached the coffin, hesitantly, and when I looked again at the dead man's face, he seemed peaceful, different, slightly smiling. From that moment on, I knew I'd crossed a boundary. Something had changed, and I could never go back to the comfortable ignorance I had before. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, tossed and turned, closed my eyes, but all I could hear was the sound of her voice, not the exact words, because I didn't understand them, but thetum, the melody of that low, firm speech, loaded with an intention that the body recognizes even before the mind. The whispered intonation stuck inside me like a crack that won't close, echoing in the intervals between my heartbeats. And even though I couldn't remember the words, there was a phrase that wouldn't leave me alone. A phrase that seemed to have stuck inside me. It's not your time yet. For days, I carried that phrase as if it were a sacred and cursed secret at the same time. I asked myself, who did she say that to? To the dead? To me? To someone who wasn't there but was watching from another place? The more I tried to forget, the more it grew. And with it came the signs. On the first day, I heard noises in the basement of the funeral home after midnight. It sounded like slow footsteps walking across the old wooden floor. I went downstairs with my flashlight in hand, sweating cold, but there was no one there. On the second day, when I opened the chapel in the morning, I found one of the candles lit. No staff had been there. On the third day, a photograph of a deceased person, already buried, was lying on the floor of the reception area. It was the same man whose body I had seen moving in the coffin. This could not be a coincidence, not after what I had witnessed. The nights began to be filled with lucid dreams in which I walked among open coffins, hearing whispers coming from all sides. The voices called my name. They repeated disconnected phrases full of lament and despair, but among them all, one stood out, always hers, calmly saying, "Some souls need permission." I would always wake up sweating, with the feeling that there was something or someone at the foot of the bed. One night, I swear, I felt a gentle breath in my ear. There was no open window, no wind, no breeze, just that icy sensation of presence that chills you to the bone. Since then, I stopped sleeping in the dark. I began to develop small habits that made me feel at least a little safe. Lighting a candle in my room, keeping coarse salt by my bedside, carrying an old crucifix that my grandmother had given me. All of this because, even in silence, I felt that she was still close by, that what I had seen had not ended there. It was as if, by witnessing what should not be seen, I had been marked. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, one question kept hammering at my mind. If she said it wasn't his time yet, then when is mine? After that experience, nothing felt real anymore. The days began to blur. I went about my funeral home chores on autopilot, preparing bodies, arranging flowers, cleaning the chapel. But I no longer felt like I was in control. It was as if my mind had been pushed into the background where I could just watch my own life unfold. Everything felt slow, distant, heavy, and at the same time, restless. My colleagues started to notice. They were commenting among themselves that I was quieter, more withdrawn, always staring off into space. One of them took me aside, worried, and asked if I was having problems at home. I almost answered that my problem wasn't at home, but inside the cemetery. And maybe it wasn't. Even of this world, but I smiled, thanked him for his concern, and said that I was just tired. He accepted it. Most people accept it when you give a simple answer. No one wants to deal with the inexplicable. I started avoiding funerals at night. I couldn't stay in the chapel after sunset. The light changed, the air changed, and the mere thought of seeing her again made me nauseous. I even pretended to be sick so I wouldn't attend certain ceremonies. I felt like a coward, but I couldn't react any other way. Fear was in my veins. It wasn't a common fear, the kind that comes and goes. It was a different kind. A fear that lodges itself in your chest and slowly grows, as if it were colonizing you from within. The nights became torture. I slept badly, woke up sweaty, and had the constant feeling that someone was watching me. One time I found a mark on the bathroom mirror, a strange symbol drawn with something that looked like condensed steam. I wiped it away, but it was back the next night. It was the same symbol I'd seen discreetly carved into the wood of the coffin at that last funeral. I began to wonder if it was a coincidence, or if some kind of message was being left for me. Over time, I realized that it wasn't just my psyche that was being eroded. My body was also showing signs. I lost weight, my eyes were constantly red. Involuntary tremors in my hands began to bother me. With every sneeze or headache, I imagined I was being punished for having seen something I shouldn't have. And deep down, maybe I really was, because there is a type of knowledge that doesn't liberate. It only condemns. I avoided telling anyone. I had no proof, just memories, feelings, and a spiral of fear that dragged me deeper and deeper. But even with all this internal terror, there was something even more powerful pushing me. The need to understand. I needed to know who she was, where she came from, what she did, and most of all, why. If I didn't find answers, I knew I would end up losing what was left of my sanity. It was on a cloudy morning, after another sleepless night and a confusing dream involving candles, coffins, and whispered voices, that I decided to look for answers. If this woman was a regular in town, someone must know who she was. A name, an address, some history. I convinced myself that perhaps there was a logical explanation for all this. Maybe she was just an elderly lady with some kind of grief disorder or an unhealthy obsession with funerals. If that were the case, I would be able to sleep again. I started asking around the funeral home, subtly, among co-workers and former employees. The answers were vague and confusing. Some said they had seen a lady in brown at some funerals, but no one remembered her face. Others thought I was confusing her with the widow of a former local pastor, but when I looked into the story, I discovered that the widow had died in 1994. The pattern repeated itself. Everyone remembered her in some distant shadow of memory, but no one knew who she really was. It was as if she was there, but not in the record. So I went to the town clerk's office. I asked for access to the public death records and attendance lists from older funerals. I was polite and patient. I said I was doing some sort of survey to help the funeral home organize its files. I spent hours searching through names, comparing dates, noting the funerals she'd probably attended. No solid leads, nothing of note. But then, as I was looking through a folder of old photos from the 1960s, something stopped me in my tracks. It was a black and white photo, a record of the chapel's reopening in 1965. The photo showed the renovated altar with a few people sitting in the front rows. But what chilled me to the bone was seeing her there in the back row, same coat, same hairdo, same stare straight ahead. There was no mistaking it. It was her. Exactly as I had seen her that week. No difference at all. 60 years later, the same face, the same figure, unbroken. I asked for a copy of the image. The clerk at the registry office looked at me strangely, as if he hadn't noticed anyone in the last row. When I pointed my finger, he frowned and said that maybe it was just a shadow, a flaw in the old revelation. But I knew, I saw clearly what others didn't. This woman was no ordinary visitor. And from that moment on, it was clear to me that she didn't just attend funerals. She crossed they. With the photo in hand, I went home and sat at the table, trying to understand what it meant. If she was already there in the 60s, how many funerals would she have attended? How many people would have been touched by her whisper? And why, of all the others, was he the only one who noticed? The next wake seemed at first glance like any other. A man in his 60s had died in his sleep, the victim of a massive aneurysm. He was well known in town, the owner of a small local market and respected by everyone. The family had asked for a traditional ceremony, nothing too long, just long enough for distant relatives to say goodbye. But when I saw the name of the deceased on the record, something inside me tightened. I felt a kind of chill crawl up my spine. It was not a common name, and the kind of sudden death was exactly the kind that attracted her. I spent the entire day on high alert. The clock seemed to tick slowly, and everything around me sounded quieter than usual. I arranged the chapel with excessive care, as if I were preparing a stage, not for a wake, but for a confrontation. This time I would not hide. I would not cower behind any screen. I wanted to see her up close. I wanted to understand, or at least have the courage to face what, until then, had been lurking in the shadows. I knew she would come, and she would come to stay until the end. The ceremony began promptly at 5 p.m. The chapel was full of friends, family, neighbors, but my gaze sought only one face, and there she was. She appeared discreetly among the guests, as if the space around her gave way of its own accord. She sat on the same bench as always, in the same posture, with the same serene expression. It was as if she was stuck in a loop, a scene that repeated itself with surgical precision. Funeral after funeral, I remained standing, leaning against the wall next to the altar, pretending to follow the sermon, but my eyes never left hers for a second. This time, I wanted her to know, to see that I was there, watching, aware, and she noticed at a certain point between one prayer and another, her eyes moved toward me. It was quick, but it was real. A slight eye contact, and then a smile, small, almost imperceptible, but a smile. And that gesture paralyzed me more than anything before, because there, for the first time, she acknowledged my presence, and I understood that the game had changed. As the ceremony ended and the guests left, the chapel slowly emptied. My colleagues asked me if I needed help closing the coffin, but I refused. I wanted to be alone. They left, and then it was just the two of us, she and I, absolute silence. The yellowish light of the chapel created long shadows on the empty pews. The scent of lilies began to weigh heavily on the air, and she remained seated until, as calmly as ever, she stood up. She walked slowly to the coffin and stood in front of it. I, a few steps away, did not move. My heart was beating loudly, but my desire to see was stronger than my fear. She placed her hands on the coffin and, without saying a word, leaned forward slightly. And then the whisper, that almost inaudible sound that seemed to pierce the air like a beam of pure cold. Only this time, I heard it clearly. The words that came out of her mouth were, "Some souls don't know how to go alone. That's why I guide them." At that moment, I felt the temperature drop around me. It was like being plunged into ice-cold water. The air became thick, hard to breathe. The coffin shook subtly, a tiny movement. But it made the glass vibrate slightly. I looked directly at her, and then she turned to me. Her eyes had no shine, just a dark, deep, silent abyss. She walked slowly over to where I was standing and stopped less than a meter away from me. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Time, sound, reason. I couldn't move. And then she spoke, directly to me for the first time. "Now you see. Now you carry." And before I could ask what it meant, she turned and left. She walked out the door, disappearing. Into the mist, as if she had dissolved into thin air. I stood there alone, listening to the sound of my own heart and the whisper that belonged to no one else. The coffin was still, the candle still lit, but something had changed forever, and I was no longer just a gravedigger. After that wake, I returned home carrying something that was invisible, but weighed more than anything I had ever carried on my shoulders. I tried to continue my routine, to keep to my schedule, to follow the funeral home protocols, as I always had. But everything had changed. The walls of my world seemed thinner and the air thicker. It was as if I were walking around with an invisible veil over my eyes, which no longer allowed me to see things the same way. Death, which had always been part of my work, was now staring back at me. The nights began to drag on. I slept with the lights on. Every sound in the house, the creaking of the floorboards, the dripping of the faucet, the creaking of the windows seemed amplified. At times I swore I heard footsteps in the hallway, but when I checked, there was nothing. Just silence. But it wasn't just any silence. It was the kind of silence that seems to hold something inside, something waiting to reveal itself. In the following days, I received a notification from the administration to accompany the exhumation of 2 recently buried bodies. This was standard procedure for legal reasons. When I arrived at the site with the assistants, something caught my attention even before they opened the urns. Both graves were strange. The soil was softer than it should have been, and the concrete of the protective slab seemed to have been slightly displaced, as if someone or something had moved there from the inside. During the exhumation, I felt my stomach turn. One of the bodies, which should have been intact, had small marks around the mouth and ear, like superficial scratches. And the most absurd thing, inside the coffin, there was an object that was not listed in the funeral inventory. A piece of old yellowed cloth with inscriptions that seemed to be handmade. I asked the others to move away and stood there, alone for a few minutes. I watched that cloth as if it were about to move. It was the same symbol I had seen drawn on the mirror in my house weeks ago. Now it was there, sewn into an old cloth inside a tomb. This could not be a coincidence. And this was no longer just an isolated phenomenon. It was a pattern. That night, I went through my old notebooks, pages and pages of dates, times, names, and there, amid those hastily scribbled notes, I found something that chilled me to the core. At every funeral she attended, there was a repeating number, the number 33. Either it was the age of the deceased or the time the ceremony ended, or the number on the headstone. Always, somehow, the number 33 appeared. I didn't understand what it meant, but I sensed it wasn't random. It was a signature, a mark. I went back. To reviewing the records of recent funerals, I marked with a red pen all the ones she had attended. In all of them, the bodies showed some anomaly. Small, but real. A reflex in the mouth, partially open eyes, broken nails. And the technical records, of course, always found a logical explanation. Post-mortem contractions, failure in conservation, human error. But I knew that it wasn't natural. Death, in these cases, was not being respected. It was being manipulated, touched, interrupted by something or someone, and then I began to realize how deeply it had infiltrated me. I wasn't eating properly, I could barely sleep, and yet I refused to seek help. Because who in their right mind would believe what I was saying? Who would accept that a silent, frail-looking woman could be involved in something that defied the laws of life and death? I began to avoid the chapel, especially during the hours when it was most likely to appear. But it was no use. Even from a distance, I could feel its presence approaching. And it wasn't just me. Other employees began to miss work. One asked for a transfer, another disappeared without warning. The chapel, once a place of peaceful mourning, now seemed to carry an invisible electricity, as if everything there was on the verge of exploding. And yet no one spoke of it, as if it had never existed. The administration even commented on the heavy energy of the place, suggesting small renovations, changes in the lighting. But nothing changed. The security cameras captured strange noises during the early hours of the morning. The candles went out by themselves. On more than one occasion, witnesses reported shadows. But always, the files of these recordings were corrupted or simply disappeared. But I knew, I saw, I heard. And by then, it was no longer a question of running away. It was just a matter of time. Because what I discovered after that, what finally showed me the purpose behind it all, was still buried, waiting to emerge. And when that happens, not even the dead will rest. If you've made it this far, you might think this story ends with the final wake. Maybe you imagine that after that encounter, I finally had answers, or that I found some way to let go of what I've been carrying ever since. But the truth, the cruelest of all, is that it's not over, because what she said that night still echoes inside me like a pact. Now you see, now you carry, and I carry it. I carry it every day. I don't know what exactly was placed on my shoulders, but since that wake, nothing is the same. I see signs, things that others don't see, sounds that don't belong on this plane. And sometimes when I'm alone in the chapel, arranging the flowers or lighting the candles, I feel like she's still there. Not as a visitor, but as a shadow that follows me, as if, somehow, she left a part of herself inside me. Or as if she's waiting for the right time to come back and show me what comes next. Some nights I dream of funerals that haven't happened yet, of faces I've never seen, and coffins that move inside, dreams so vivid that I wake up with sweaty clothes and the sound of the whisper still vibrating in my ear. It's not your time yet. But can this also change? Maybe, by telling this story, I'm passing on something that should not be said out loud. Maybe I am risking that someone out there, on the other side of the screen, will hear the same whisper, or see the same figure, standing in the background at the next funeral, because it does not appear to everyone, only to those who need to see it, only to those who carry it, like me. And if you think all this is too much, wait until you hear the next story, because in the next video, I'm going to tell you about the body that appeared with its mouth sewn shut inside the coffin. And no one, absolutely no one, opened that lid. Sign up now, because what comes next is even harder to bury.